In the summer of 1941, as Japan's military planners finalized operational timetables for expansion across East and Southeast Asia, air power occupied an oddly constrained place in their strategic calculus. Aviation was understood as essential, but not decisive in isolation. The prevailing assumption inside both the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy was that air units existed primarily to enable maneuver, by suppressing enemy resistance locally, shielding advances temporarily, and then moving forward as the ground or naval front progressed. Air power was not expected to sustain independent, long-duration campaigns for regional control. It was a supporting instrument, not a strategic arm. This assumption shaped the creation and employment of several Japanese air formations that would later find themselves operating far from the decisive naval battles that dominate most World War II narratives. Among them was a Japanese Army Air Division tasked with operations across a geographically fragmented theater, one defined by long distances, weak infrastructure, and enemies whose air strength appeared, at least initially, marginal. Its mission profile reflected institutional confidence rather than caution: gain local air superiority quickly, maintain it with aggressive forward basing, and accept attrition as the cost of tempo. At the outset, this belief appeared justified. Japanese aviation doctrine had been forged in the skies over China during the late 1930s, where Army air units routinely achieved dominance against under-equipped and poorly coordinated opponents. Fighter pilots flying aircraft such as the Ki-27 and later, the Ki-43 developed a culture of offensive engagement, emphasizing maneuverability, pilot skill, and close cooperation with ground forces. Losses were tolerated because replacements could be trained rapidly, and because no opponent had yet demonstrated the ability to contest Japanese control of the air over extended periods. What planners extrapolated from these experiences was not merely confidence in aircraft performance, but faith in a system. That system assumed short campaigns, forward momentum, and an enemy whose industrial and logistical capacity could not rapidly regenerate losses. Under those conditions, an air division could operate with limited reserves, modest maintenance depth, and a command structure optimized for tactical responsiveness rather than strategic endurance. By late 1941, when Japanese forces prepared for simultaneous operations across the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and China, this assumption was embedded deeply enough that it went largely unchallenged. Air divisions were organized to leapfrog forward with advancing armies, establishing temporary airfields, flying high sortie rates, and then moving again. The expectation was that the decisive phase of any campaign would conclude before systemic strain set in. This logic governed the deployment of a lesser-known Japanese Army air formation, assigned to operations in a peripheral yet strategically sensitive region. Its responsibilities included interdiction of enemy supply lines, protection of ground offensives through difficult terrain, and denial of airspace to Allied forces attempting to reinforce or reorganize. Success depended not on annihilating the enemy air force outright, but on keeping it disrupted long enough for ground objectives to be secured. Crucially, the assumption also shaped what planners did not prioritize. Aircraft survivability, pilot rest cycles, long-term spare parts availability, and layered air defense were all treated as secondary concerns. The air division was not designed to absorb sustained pressure. It was designed to impose pressure first. This approach made sense within Japan's broader strategic worldview. The Imperial Japanese Army believed wars were decided by offensive spirit and speed. Air units, like infantry formations, were expected to fight forward, accept losses, and maintain initiative. Defensive air operations, such as systematic protection of rear areas or conservation of airframes, were viewed as signs of passivity. Even when intelligence suggested Allied air production was increasing, the prevailing belief held that operational daring could offset material disparity, at least long enough to secure favorable terms. Within this framework, the Air Division's command structure reinforced the assumption. Authority was centralized at the divisional level, but execution authority was pushed downward. Squadron commanders were encouraged to seize fleeting opportunities rather than await detailed instructions. This produced high sortie rates and rapid reaction, but it also meant attrition decisions were made tactically, without a clear mechanism to assess cumulative losses across weeks or months. Another embedded assumption concerned geography. Japanese planners believed that operating over jungle, mountains, and underdeveloped regions favored their forces. The logic was straightforward. Poor infrastructure would limit Allied air operations more severely than Japanese ones, because Japanese air units were accustomed to austere conditions. What this analysis underestimated was not the difficulty of terrain, but the compounding effect of distance. Forward airfields solved short-term access problems but created long-term logistical vulnerability, particularly for fuel, replacement engines, and trained ground crews. At the operational level, the Air Division's mission was framed as an enabling action rather than a contest of endurance. It was tasked with suppressing enemy airfields, escorting bombers against transportation nodes, and providing close air support to advancing ground formations. There was no expectation that it would need to defend air superiority indefinitely. The campaign timeline assumed that decisive results would be achieved before the enemy could adapt. This belief extended to assessments of Allied doctrine. Early encounters reinforced Japanese confidence. Allied pilots were often less experienced. Aircraft performance appeared inferior in maneuver combat, and coordination between air and ground units was inconsistent. These observations were accurate, initially. What they masked was the presence of a fundamentally different Allied system, one capable of absorbing early losses, learning rapidly, and scaling output far beyond pre-war levels. The Japanese Air Division was therefore committed under a set of assumptions that aligned neatly with early war conditions but poorly with long-term realities. It was structured for momentum, not sustainability, for tactical brilliance, not operational resilience. Every success it achieved reinforced the belief that the system worked, even as underlying vulnerabilities accumulated unnoticed. By 1942, the Air Division had logged thousands of sorties and claimed significant tactical successes. Enemy movements were disrupted, ground offensives were supported, and regional air superiority appeared intact. Yet beneath these surface indicators, strain was already visible. Maintenance backlogs grew, experienced pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced, and forward bases became increasingly exposed to interdiction. The assumption that air superiority could be seized quickly and held long enough for victory to be secured had not yet collapsed, but it was no longer universally true. By late 1942, as Allied air strength expanded and operational tempo shifted from rapid advance to contested holding actions, this assumption stopped being true. The Japanese Army Air Division deployed into this theater was not an improvised formation. It was the product of a doctrinal system refined over more than a decade, shaped by interwar theory, combat experience in China, and institutional assumptions about how wars would be fought and won. Understanding its later failure requires first understanding how the system was intended to function when conditions matched expectations. At its core, Japanese Army aviation doctrine treated air power as an operational accelerant. Aircraft existed to compress time and space, reducing the enemy's ability to react while amplifying the speed of friendly ground operations. This logic dictated force structure. An air division typically consisted of several fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance regiments, supported by maintenance and logistics units that were deliberately kept lean. The emphasis was on mobility and forward deployment, not depth. Command relationships reflected this priority. While air divisions reported through the Army's aviation headquarters, their operational tasking was closely integrated with ground Army commands. Air units were expected to shift focus rapidly as ground objectives evolved, sometimes redeploying between forward airfields in a matter of days. Planning cycles were short. Missions were often authorized based on incomplete intelligence, with the assumption that aggressive action would compensate for uncertainty. Aircraft selection reinforced this approach. Fighters such as the Ki-43 emphasized maneuverability and range over armor or firepower. Bombers were optimized for medium-range operations against tactical targets, bridges, supply depots, troop concentrations, rather than strategic industrial sites. The system assumed that enemy resistance would degrade faster than Japanese airframes, allowing attrition to be managed through offensive pressure. Information flow within the system was similarly optimized for speed rather than accuracy. Reconnaissance aircraft provided visual reports that were rapidly disseminated but rarely corroborated. Signals intelligence played a limited role, and centralized analysis was minimal. The expectation was that the enemy's intentions could be inferred from movement patterns and that opportunities, once identified, would remain valid long enough to exploit. Logistics planning followed the same logic. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were pushed forward aggressively, often stockpiled at temporary airfields close to the front. This reduced response time but increased vulnerability. The system worked only if the front continued to move forward. Static defense or prolonged contests over the same airspace were not scenarios for which the air division was designed. Pilot training was another critical component of the system. Pre-war Japanese Army pilots underwent rigorous selection and training, producing aviators with high individual skill. However, the system assumed low pilot turnover. Training pipelines were not scaled for sustained attrition because doctrine assumed wars would be decided before such attrition became decisive. As a result, pilot quality was treated as a fixed asset rather than a renewable one. Maintenance doctrine further illustrates the system's priorities. Aircraft were serviced to keep them flying at high sortie rates, sometimes at the expense of long-term airframe integrity. Deferred maintenance was an accepted practice, justified by the belief that aircraft would either be lost in combat or rendered obsolete before structural fatigue became an issue. This assumption reduced downtime in the short term, but eroded reliability over time. Crucially, the system depended on initiative at the tactical level. Squadron and regimental commanders were expected to act aggressively, exploiting fleeting advantages without awaiting detailed guidance. This produced impressive early results. Enemy airfields were struck repeatedly, often before defenses were fully organized. Allied pilots encountered Japanese formations that appeared omnipresent, creating an impression of overwhelming air superiority disproportionate to actual numbers. However, this decentralization also concealed systemic weaknesses. Because losses were absorbed locally and replacements were slow, higher headquarters often underestimated cumulative attrition. Aircraft availability reports lagged behind reality. Pilots flew extended rotations with minimal rest. Ground crews improvised repairs under increasingly austere conditions. None of these issues triggered immediate operational collapse, but each reduced the system's margin for error. The air division's deployment environment amplified these vulnerabilities. The theater's geography imposed long supply lines over sea and undeveloped land routes. Forward airfields were carved out of jungle or rough terrain, limiting runway length and maintenance facilities. Whether further complicated operations, degrading navigation accuracy, and increasing wear on engines and airframes. The system could function under these conditions only as long as operational tempo remained offensive and uncontested. Enemy adaptation was not built into Japanese planning models. Allied air forces were expected to contest Japanese operations sporadically, not systematically. Early Allied failures reinforced this belief. When enemy aircraft were destroyed on the ground or driven off by aggressive fighter patrols, Japanese commanders interpreted these outcomes as confirmation of doctrinal soundness rather than as transient conditions. What the system did not account for was the emergence of a feedback loop favoring the enemy. Allied forces, though initially disorganized, operated within an industrial and logistical framework capable of rapid expansion. Aircraft losses could be replaced, pilot training programs could be scaled, radar, communications, and command coordination improved steadily. Each encounter provided data that fed into a learning process largely absent on the Japanese side. Within the Japanese Air Division, adaptation was constrained by doctrine. Proposals to reduce sortie rates, consolidate bases, or shift to more defensive postures were often viewed as defeatist. The system rewarded offensive action and punished caution, not through formal orders but through institutional culture. Commanders who pressed attacks were praised. Those who preserved strength risked criticism. As the campaign progressed, the Air Division found itself performing tasks beyond its original design parameters. Instead of enabling rapid ground advances, it was increasingly required to hold airspace against a growing and improving enemy. Instead of leapfrogging forward, it was forced to operate repeatedly from the same vulnerable bases. Attrition, once an acceptable cost, began to outpace replacement capacity. The system responded as it was designed to respond, by increasing effort. Sortie rates were raised. Pilots flew more missions. Maintenance crews worked longer hours. Tactical aggressiveness intensified. In the short term, this preserved the appearance of effectiveness. Enemy losses continued. Missions were completed. Reports emphasized success. Yet each compensatory measure accelerated structural degradation. Aircraft availability declined even as mission requirements expanded. Pilot fatigue reduced situational awareness. Maintenance shortcuts increased mechanical failures. The system was functioning, but it was doing so by consuming itself. The moment of stress did not arrive as a single catastrophic event. It emerged gradually, as discrepancies between expected and actual conditions widened. The system, designed for brief, decisive campaigns, was now engaged in a protracted contest of endurance. It could not recalibrate without abandoning its foundational assumptions. By mid-campaign, the Air Division was still flying, still fighting, and still achieving tactical effects. But its ability to shape the operational environment was eroding. Air superiority was no longer assured. Every mission now carried strategic risk, not because objectives were unclear, but because the system itself was approaching its limits. The stage was set for failure, not because of individual errors, but because the system was being asked to do something it was never designed to sustain. The failure of the Japanese Army Air Division did not manifest as a sudden collapse. It unfolded as a cumulative process, driven by the interaction between an inflexible system and a changing operational environment. The critical factor was not a single battle or loss, but the point at which the division's assumptions about time, attrition, and enemy capacity became irreconcilable with reality. By early 1943, the operational tempo imposed on the division had already exceeded its design limits. Sortie rates remained high, often multiple missions per aircraft per day, despite declining aircraft availability. Maintenance units reported increasing delays in engine overhauls and structural repairs, but these warnings were filtered through command channels that prioritized mission completion over sustainability. Aircraft deemed flyable were returned to service even when margins of safety narrowed. Chronologically, the pressure intensified as Allied air forces began to contest airspace systematically rather than episodically. New fighter types with improved speed, firepower, and durability appeared in increasing numbers. More importantly, Allied commanders shifted from reactive defense to deliberate attritional strategy. Japanese airfields were no longer merely obstacles to be bypassed. They became targets for sustained suppression. The first compounding failure emerged in reconnaissance accuracy. Japanese visual reconnaissance, already limited by weather and range, struggled to detect the scale and timing of Allied reinforcements. Reports continued to describe enemy air activity as fragmented, even as operational data suggested otherwise. As a result, mission planning underestimated interception risk. Fighter escorts were assigned based on outdated threat models, leaving bomber formations exposed to increasingly coordinated opposition. Loss rates rose incrementally rather than dramatically. A few aircraft failed to return from each mission. Veteran pilots were lost not in mass engagements, but through repeated exposure. The training system could not replace them at the same rate or quality. New pilots arrived with fewer flight hours and limited combat preparation, yet were immediately committed to frontline operations. The division's qualitative edge, once its defining advantage, began to erode. At the same time, forward basing strategy became a liability. Airfields constructed for temporary use were now subjected to repeated attack. Runways were cratered faster than they could be repaired. Fuel dumps and maintenance areas, often poorly dispersed, suffered losses that disrupted sortie generation. Each disruption forced aircraft to operate from more distant bases, increasing transit time and reducing loiter capability over target areas. These factors interacted in predictable but underappreciated ways. Longer transit times increased pilot fatigue and fuel consumption. Reduced loiter time limited mission effectiveness, requiring additional sorties to achieve the same operational effect. Additional sorties accelerated wear on aircraft and crews. The system responded by demanding still more effort, further tightening the cycle. A critical irreversible point emerged when aircraft losses exceeded replacement throughput for several consecutive months. This was not immediately apparent at higher headquarters, where aggregate numbers masked frontline reality. On paper, the division still possessed a viable order of battle. In practice, serviceable aircraft counts fluctuated unpredictably, and unit commanders increasingly planned missions around what could be spared rather than what was required. The enemy exploited these conditions methodically. Allied air forces adjusted tactics to maximize Japanese vulnerability, favoring head-on attacks that negated maneuverability advantages and targeting aircraft during takeoff and landing phases. Radar and improved communications allowed interceptors to be vectored efficiently, reducing Japanese surprise. Each engagement produced marginal gains that accumulated over time. One illustrative sequence occurred during a period of intensified operations aimed at disrupting Allied ground movements. Japanese planners expected limited resistance based on prior patterns. Instead, bomber formations encountered layered defenses, coordinated fighter interception, and anti-aircraft fire concentrated around key approach corridors. Losses during these missions did not prevent completion of objectives, but they further reduced the division's operational depth. It was at this stage that outcomes became effectively irreversible. The division could still inflict damage, but it could no longer control the tempo of engagement. Initiative shifted to the enemy, who could choose when and where to contest airspace. Japanese commanders retained tactical aggressiveness but lost strategic flexibility. Every mission now carried opportunity cost, not merely risk. Institutional response mechanisms proved inadequate. Rather than recalibrating doctrine, higher command emphasized perseverance. Operational orders stressed the importance of maintaining pressure and preserving fighting spirit. Structural issues, training throughput, logistics capacity, aircraft design trade-offs were beyond the division's ability to correct. Adjustments, where made, were incremental and reactive. The system's failure was therefore not dramatic but definitive. By the time commanders recognized that air superiority could no longer be assumed, the resources required to regain it no longer existed. Attrition had hollowed out the division's core competencies. Aircraft numbers, pilot quality, and maintenance capacity all fell below the threshold needed to impose control rather than merely contest it. If you find this kind of forgotten military history as compelling as we do, we'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing. These stories matter because they explain not just what happened, but why. By the later phases of the campaign, Japanese air operations shifted from proactive shaping of the battlefield to reactive attempts at disruption. Missions were flown to delay, harass, or impose cost, rather than to secure decisive advantage. This change was subtle in language but profound in implication. The Air Division had transitioned from a force designed to enable victory to one struggling to mitigate defeat. The failure, then, was systemic. A doctrine optimized for short, offensive campaigns encountered an adversary capable of prolonged, adaptive resistance. A command culture that rewarded initiative over conservation proved unable to manage cumulative risk. A logistics system designed for movement could not sustain static defense. None of these elements failed independently. Together, they ensured that recovery was impossible once conditions shifted. By the time the Air Division's operational effectiveness visibly declined, the decisive phase had already passed. The enemy no longer needed to defeat it outright. It was sufficient that the division could no longer prevent Allied forces from operating freely. Air superiority, once seized quickly and confidently, had been lost incrementally and permanently. The consequences of the Japanese Army Air Division's failure were not immediately obvious to contemporaneous commanders. Tactical reports continued to emphasize enemy losses, completed missions, and instances of localized success. What commanders did not yet understand was that the operational function of the division had fundamentally changed. It no longer shaped the battle space. It merely participated in it. As Allied air forces consolidated their advantage, they did not seek decisive confrontation with the remnants of Japanese aviation. Instead, they exploited freedom of action. Transport aircraft moved with increasing regularity. Reconnaissance flights mapped terrain, supply routes, and airfield locations with precision that had been impossible earlier in the campaign. Close air support became more responsive and more destructive because it was no longer constrained by the threat of systematic interception. This shift had immediate effects on ground operations. Japanese units that had once relied on air cover to offset numerical or logistical disadvantages now found themselves exposed. Supply movements conducted in daylight suffered growing losses. Communications nodes, once considered relatively secure, were struck repeatedly. The ground forces' ability to maneuver independently of fixed infrastructure eroded as air interdiction intensified. Command reactions reflected institutional lag rather than strategic adaptation. Requests were made for reinforcement of air units, but these requests competed with demands from other theaters deemed more decisive. Aircraft allocations favored areas closer to the home islands or major naval operations. The Air Division, operating in what had become a secondary theater, was increasingly asked to achieve more with less. Efforts to compensate focused on dispersal and camouflage rather than restoration of air superiority. Airfields were hidden more carefully. Aircraft were spread across auxiliary strips. These measures reduced losses on the ground but further complicated maintenance and sortie generation. The trade-off favored survivability over effectiveness, reinforcing the division's transition from offensive tool to defensive liability. The full strategic impact would only become clear later, as Allied forces exploited uncontested airspace to accelerate their campaigns. The absence of effective Japanese air opposition shortened timelines, reduced Allied casualties, and increased operational confidence. What had once been a contested environment became permissive, allowing planners to assume air dominance as a constant rather than a variable. For Japanese higher command, the loss of regional air superiority constrained strategic choice. Counteroffensives that depended on air cover were postponed or abandoned. Reinforcement efforts were delayed or rerouted to avoid air attack, increasing transit times and attrition. Each adjustment narrowed options further, creating a feedback loop in which declining air power reduced the feasibility of actions that might have restored it. Importantly, the consequences extended beyond the immediate theater. The Air Division's experience was not fully integrated into doctrinal revision. Lessons were observed but not institutionalized. The same assumptions about offensive tempo, attrition tolerance, and pilot quality persisted elsewhere, even as evidence mounted that they were no longer valid against an industrially superior adversary. By the latter stages of the war, the division's remnants continued to operate, but their role was largely symbolic. They demonstrated persistence rather than control. From the enemy's perspective, they were obstacles to be managed, not threats to be neutralized. Air superiority had shifted from a contested condition to a baseline assumption. This outcome did not hinge on any single defeat. It emerged because the loss of air control altered every subsequent decision. Operations that once depended on speed and surprise now required concealment and delay. Initiative passed irreversibly to the opponent. The division's failure therefore functioned as a strategic inflection point, even if it was never formally recognized as such at the time. The broader consequence was a recalibration of power in the region. Allied forces no longer needed to account for Japanese air reaction as a decisive factor. Planning horizons expanded. Risk tolerance increased. What had been a fragile equilibrium early in the war became a one-sided operational environment. The Air Division's story illustrates how the erosion of a single system can cascade outward. Air superiority was not an isolated advantage. It was the connective tissue linking maneuver, logistics, and command. Once it failed, compensatory measures elsewhere proved insufficient. The lesson of the Japanese Army Air Division's wartime experience is not about courage, sacrifice, or missed opportunity. It is about systems operating beyond their design assumptions, and the consequences of institutional rigidity when conditions change faster than doctrine can adapt. What failed was not execution in the narrow sense. Missions were flown as ordered. Pilots continued to engage aggressively. Ground crews sustained aircraft under extreme conditions. Commanders responded to pressure by intensifying effort rather than retreating from responsibility. By the internal metrics of the institution, the system continued to function. That perception delayed recognition of structural failure. The core failure lay in the original assumption that air power could be employed as a temporary enabler rather than a continuously contested domain. Japanese Army aviation doctrine treated air superiority as something to be seized quickly and exploited briefly, not something that required long-term investment, layered defense, and adaptive learning. When the war evolved into a prolonged contest of industrial capacity and organizational resilience, the system had no mechanism to recalibrate. Correction was impossible because the constraints were systemic. Pilot training pipelines could not be expanded rapidly without lowering standards that doctrine treated as essential. Aircraft design choices favored performance characteristics that could not be retrofitted to improve survivability under new threat conditions. Logistics systems optimized for movement could not easily be transformed into ones optimized for sustainment. Each potential adjustment conflicted with deeply embedded institutional beliefs. Equally important was the absence of feedback integration. Tactical observations about enemy adaptation were not translated into doctrinal revision at a pace sufficient to matter. Losses were interpreted as the cost of maintaining pressure rather than as indicators of diminishing returns. By the time air superiority was clearly lost, the resources required to restore it, trained pilots, serviceable aircraft, secure bases, no longer existed in sufficient quantity. The relevance of this failure extends beyond its historical context. Modern military institutions still grapple with the challenge of designing systems for the wars they expect while retaining flexibility for those they do not. The Japanese Air Division's experience demonstrates that tactical excellence cannot compensate indefinitely for structural misalignment. Speed and initiative are powerful advantages, but only when supported by systems capable of sustaining them over time. It also illustrates a broader principle. Attrition is not merely a function of losses incurred, but of replacement capacity and learning rate. An adversary that can lose quickly, learn faster, and replace losses at scale will eventually prevail over a force optimized for early dominance. The Japanese Air Division did not lose because it fought poorly, but because it fought within a framework that assumed the enemy could not adapt at the same pace. In the end, the division's obscurity in historical memory is itself instructive. Overshadowed by larger naval battles and catastrophic defeats elsewhere, its gradual failure lacks dramatic punctuation, yet it represents a decisive shift in operational reality. Air superiority was not lost in a single day or battle. It was eroded through systemic mismatch. The restrained gravity of this lesson lies in its universality. Military systems rarely fail at the moment they appear weakest. They fail when they continue to operate convincingly, after their foundational assumptions have ceased to be true.